Here's an interesting statistic. A Hall of Fame basketball coach had a better winning percentage when he had a 1 day prep versus a 2 day prep in the postseason. Why? In reflection, he realized that he was forced to prioritize information on the 1 day prep and he overloaded the team with information when he had more time to prepare. Experience is a wonderful teacher, and someone who works with coaches in schools to create a better teaching experience is Doug Lemov. He will make you think. We started the conversation with something that Brad Stevens, current Boston Celtics GM, told me. He said there's almost an expectation that when you reach the Final Four, you should write a book about it. Brad was in his 30s when that happened to him. And now looking back, he said, thank God I didn't. I didn't know anything back then. Doug understands where Brad is coming from because as an author, you learn so much about what you write about after you write about it. And that's where we'll jump in. Here's one of the best lessons Doug has learned about being an author.
You have to let it go at some point and know that what you write about is going to be imperfect, and you're going to look back at it later and think, oh, I wish I hadn't said that, or like, how could I have not seen this really important connection that's sitting right there? Because the great thing about the book is that people then want to talk to you about it, and the people who talk to you about it have really great insights, and there's a ton of like new things to keep learning. So I think you have to see it as like a midpoint in your learning journey.
What is the thing that you've learned since that you can't wait to write about?
I mean, I think there are a couple of them. One of them for sure is I'm really excited to write a chapter about video use. I think like the world has changed in terms of just the accessibility of video as a teaching tool. But I think like it's an incredibly high difficulty dive to ask an athlete to do what we do when we show them video. First, let me just take a tiny step back. I work with a couple of coaches in the NBA, I work with a Premier League team, I work with a couple of national rugby teams. Those athletes spend more time in the video room than they do on the field or on the court, right? They're managing their physical load, right? There is this giant bet that we're making that I will be able to sit you down in a room and show you video of yourself or of the opposition, and you will learn sufficient, and that will be a competitive advantage to you. And I think it's true that it can work, but I don't think that it automatically works. And I think the first thing is just to recognize what an incredibly difficult thing you're asking an athlete to do cognitively. Just think for a minute about like the video is shot from the top of the arena at from 300 feet away. And we're talking sometimes about like, what are the visual cues? What do you notice the opposition doing that should tell you that we should play wide here? And then I have to translate that into like seeing it from an on the floor angle in the middle of competition when someone is trying to punch me in the mouth. And I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I just think we should be aware of what a challenging thing that is to ask an athlete to do. For one of the clubs that I work with, they asked me to kind of call a bunch of cognitive scientists and ask them what they thought about showing video. And one of the things that this cognitive scientist that I talked to said that I thought it was really interesting. He said, in my observations, about 75 to 80% of the video use that coaches do with players is corrective. Here's you. What's wrong with your positioning here? Here's us. What's wrong with our shape? What do we get wrong here? And his argument is that one of the things you need most to be able to make decisions in a complex environment quickly is a mental model. I need to have a really clear picture in my head of what correct looks like, what our game model looks like. This is what we look like when we were doing it right. And he said, if it were me, I would flip it. And I would do 75%. Like I want to wire people's brains to have a picture of what it looks like when it's done right. So they instantly see when something is out of, I think this is how human cognition works. Like we're not looking that carefully, and then something calls our attention to the fact that something is out of place, something looks wrong, and then I correct it. And I think that that's really interesting. Just a really interesting idea. You think about a game of soccer, kids who grow up in Spain watch 1,000 matches of where they understand that the purpose is not to make 12 touches on the ball. The purpose is to make 1 or 2 touches on the ball. So no one has to explain that to them, right? That's in their mental model. And if someone's taking too many touches on the ball, it clangs for them. They're like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. And a lot of kids in America grow up, they're highly skilled at the game, but they don't have this mental model of my purpose is not to take 12 touches. My purpose is to take 2.
Let's say that they're getting positive reinforcement for behaviors that actually don't help the team.
Happens all the time. Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
This is one of the biggest coaching problems in a youth sport, which is it is very easy to reinforce kids who young people who help us win by doing short-term behaviors that are short-term productive, but not long-term productive, right? The classic case of this is you've got a super athlete and you can put them on the wing and they're going to get open and they're going to get into space, or that, they're going to be able to, like, they're faster and they're bigger than everybody else. And I just think, like, this is the tested ego, which is, do I love my kids enough to say, I know you can score that goal. I know you can make me look good as a coach by scoring that goal, and we'll be 8-1. And to say, 5 years from now, when everyone is big and everyone is fast and you're at the next level and there are 11 of them and there is one of you, you have to learn to play as a team. You have to be able to play with your back to the goal. You have to be able to give that ball up. I think that is, like, the single biggest challenge of youth coaching sports, is to take the long view. And in some ways it requires putting your ego in check, I think. But it also, like, the ironic thing is that the people who should be most aligned to you on that decision are parents.
And why is there a gap in your mind?
Like, they should be the people who are happiest when you're like, I don't care if we win this game, I'm going to make long-term investments in what's best for your child. And often the parents are the first people shouting when you don't win. They move their kid to another team when you don't win. They don't, I think there are steps we can take to help inform parents, right? Like, if I'm transparent and, like, this is what we're trying to accomplish with your kids, like, just telling them the story, which is, I don't want your kid to be great this season. I want your kid to be great throughout their journey. And so these are the things that I'm trying to do. And these are the things that you should say. This is the vocabulary that we use. And these are the things. You won't win every parent that way, but I think you can win some of them by just informing them and making them partners in the process and making them understand the process. But I also think that, one of the larger challenges in society right now, one of the largest social trends in society, is decline of faith in institutions. People used to trust the school that you send your kids to, the coach, right? Coach knows best, do what coach says. And now it's like, coach isn't playing you and you think you should be playing, they're like, let's start looking for another club. Like, so I think that's, that is a real challenge that we have to face. But I think that informing people and helping them to understand your competence. Like, I think competence and skill are antidotes against decline of faith in institutions. That when you show we're good at this, there's a long view. This is what happens to players who stick with this model. This is why we're doing this. This is the research behind it. You're more likely to win a lot of the parents. And then I guess you have to be willing to let some people walk away if it gets to the point where they're just, it's a collective action problem.
There it is, man. Because the challenge is, oftentimes the people that have the most freedom abuse that freedom. And when they abuse that freedom, it creates hypocrisy inside the environment. And you have to recruit that best player or the influencer of the environment to the common vision. I want to ask you, so when you think about doing a positive process, everything looks exactly the way it should, but we're not getting the results. And then, hey, this is not what we do, and we are getting the results. What is the key in your mind from teaching to help athletes understand, don't grade it by the outcome, grade it by what went into the outcome?
Grade it by the process. Daniel Coyle has a great quote about this in the Culture Code, which is a great book. I see some people nodding that maybe you've read it. That he says, he's talking about belonging, but I think this applies to a lot of the cultural things that we try and do. He says it's like a flame that needs to be fed by constant small signals. One of the things I have to do to make people believe in process is help them to see that the process is working. So, like, that was a great touch. Think about, like, 6 months ago, would you have known to make that touch? Would you have been able to make that touch? Like, what are all the ways that's going to be able to help you, right? I have to help you to see the progress that's happening in the long run and to measure things other than wins. If I want you to value things other than wins, I have to help you to see them. And I think that happens in, like, 1,000 small interactions. Like, so proud of you. That was tremendous. If you make that decision, if you do it like that 10 times in a row, it didn't work today, but it will work 9 times out of 10. I think basketball is a great example of this. Like, it's such a numbers game. Like, you make the right defensive decisions. You're basically playing a percentage game. It's 10% less likely that he's going to hit the jumper, and sometimes he's going to hit the jumper, and my job is to help you to see the signal and not the noise. Perfect defending, you'll win in the long run.
The noise is so loud. How do you combat that?
There's a coach that I work with who does something that I really love. He's talking about shot selection with his players. Like, what is a good shot selection? They have, like, a system to describe it. And when they study video, he always cuts the video before the ball hits the basket. right? Because as soon as you see it hit the basket, if it goes in or not, you're distracted by the noise of like the false signal of what. And so he's just like, cut it before it goes. And now tell me whether you think that was a good shot. I don't even care if it went in. I just want to talk about shot selection.
Shot selection in basketball is so simple. It's take good shots, force hard shots. To your point, it is totally a percentage game. Why is it so hard at the NBA level, from your view, to get teams to execute that?
I think so. Just thinking first of all about control, like what control the controllables, we tell that to players. Also true as a coach, right? One of the things I can control is my attention. Am I consistent about paying my attention to that? Do I reinforce that sometimes, and do I let it go when it works for me at the end of it? When I'm like, and I think guy wins the game for you on a terrible shot that he shouldn't have taken. You put his arm around him and you say, "I'm really glad that went in." In the long run, tomorrow I would not even right now. Tomorrow I want to talk to you about like I want you to show that video. I want to show you that video, and you're going to be surprised by what you see. But I know like one of the NBA coaches that I work with, I love this guy. He is exactly what you were describing. Like even in the middle of the NBA season, the first 15, 20 games, he's all about process. So he says to them, I want to tell you at the outset, like we're going to be rotating lineups. We're going to be rotating lineups and starting lineups every game for the first 20 games because I want to protect you I want to protect your body. I want to experiment with a lot of things. And you know what's going to happen. As soon as the press notices that one of you is sitting and you played last night, they're going to assume that it's a judgment on your performance. And I want you to know right now that it's not, that we did this from the outset. We did it together. And my goal is to prepare you for uncertainty, to be able to play in any different combination. So we get to the end of the season, we're ready for that. And so you'll just know not to believe that source of noise. I think that's like a great thing. He's lucky in that his best player is, by NBA standards, incredibly humble, incredibly decent, incredibly team-oriented. So he will often show video of, when he wants to be critical, he'll show video of him, like the number one. And I think that says like, and often when he'll show a video of, he'll show him coming down the court and taking a shot right away. And he'll be like, I want to, even it's a decent shot, but one of our goals is that we win together. And so, ball never touched anyone else's hands, right? So like, we got to be thinking about us when the ball comes down the court, even if it went in, right? In fact, it's almost better if it's like, great shot.
Hey, can I tell you something crazy?
Yeah.
You're going to love this stat. Yeah, you're going to probably use this stat. Not since 1988, Magic Johnson had someone led the NBA in assists and won a championship. 2019, Kyle Lowry did it, but that's like an anomaly.
How do you interpret that?
To me, it shows you that teams are better when the ball moves, and guys that can control the game that much, they pass when they know it's going to lead to an assist.
Yeah. One of the things that this coach does is he has a word for this, a phrase that he describes. It's a very simple phrase. Everyone on the team knows that describes the team belief that we want to work hard and play hard, and we want to work hard together as five of us who are on the floor. And so when this happens, like he always invokes that phrase, we want to X. And I just think that like vocabulary is so underrated as a culture building tool and a teaching tool. There's a whole kind of chapter about this in the Coach's Guide to Teaching, where I talked to Jesse Marsh, he's now the national coach of he's a coach of Canada's national team, but he was in Leeds United, probably the most successful US coach ever in the Premier League. He's obsessed with vocabulary. And I think there are two categories of things that he names. He names cultural things that he wants players to do in terms of like off-ball behaviors that are unselfish, right? And if you name it and everyone knows what it means, then you can identify it more quickly and you can call it out and everyone can know what you mean. So cultural behaviors and tactical behaviors.
How do you get coaches to understand that can be a superpower for a team?
It is such a superpower because teams are first and foremost cultures, right? In every culture, if you look like the anthropological definition of culture is a set of norms, routines, beliefs, and language. Culture is always defined by language. The French conceive of themselves as French because they all speak French, right? If I speak Cajun, right, which is a form of French, like I believe, but I perceive myself to belong to that culture. I think it's shaping the language is one of the first things that we have to do if we want to have an intact culture. You don't have to tell people the fact that you speak a language and other people don't speak it, that those words are private to you. I think that's a lot of what Jesse does, which is if there's a term that's in general use in the world of soccer for a tactical decision, he won't use it. He'll recoin a different term for it. Because one, if a lot of other people are using this term, the half space, but they use it slightly differently than him, they're diluting the term. So he doesn't really control the definition for his players. But I also think he also connects terms to stories. So like he, for example, told them the story of Roger Bannister and how people thought the 4-minute mile was an unbreakable barrier, that it was beyond the limits of human endurance. And then Roger Bannister broke it. And then, like right after he broke the 4-minute mile, like 5 other guys did it in the next 3 years, right? So his takeaway from that is like your perceptions of human endurance are wrong. Like that, we can always do more. And so like he will then say like this is a Roger Bannister moment. So the vocabulary is discrete to the team, and it's unique to us. That's culture building, and it is connected to a story. One of the other like fascinating things, I'm writing about this in a book I'm writing on reading right now, because the other half of my life is in schools. But stories are cognitively privileged, and I think maybe that's the key to vocabulary, which is we evolved for hundreds of thousands of years through prehistory, sitting around campfires, telling each other stories. And the stories did 2 things. They communicated information because we didn't have written text, right? So like, here's how you hunt. And they communicated belonging and connection. Like we all hunt together. We have myths about our hunting, and like these shared stories they confer survival benefit for 2 reasons. They contain information about how to do things, and they contain information about how to belong to the group. And humans are incredibly weak individually, and they're only strong in groups. We started to evolve to become the apex predator when we started to form groups, reliable groups. We're the only species that can, for example, attack with a projectile from a distance on the planet. So the moment when we realize like, oh, if we all throw rocks together and we rely on each other, and I can trust you to throw your rock and hide behind that tree, we can actually drive off a lion or hunt a lion. And so that group formation makes us powerful. So I think like stories, we evolved to value stories immensely because they allowed us to cement our membership in the group and to communicate information. So we pay better attention, we listen better, we learn more from stories. So I think when we want to cement vocabulary, we should tell stories. And when we want to build culture, we should communicate a lot of what we want to do in stories. And I think that's how we're wired to think that way.
Let me ask you this, that term, cognitively privileged, it's a beautiful term. Can you deconstruct that?
Sure. Yeah, it's not mine. It's Daniel Willingham's, but he just mentioned it offhand in one of his books, and I sent him an email. He sent me all this research on it, right? About all the ways that, why do stories speak to us so much? So one, like I sort of said, like we pay better attention in a story because this is the way that information has often been communicated. But the story is also like almost always from the position of the protagonist, which is how we see the world, right? It's the protagonist wrestling with the decisions that he or she has to make. And so it replicates our own cognitive process, our position in the world, which is like, you could argue that like our lives are like this unfolding narrative where we're narrating to ourselves like a first person protagonist, our interaction with the world. And so I think it's another reason why stories are cognitively privileged. And I think the third reason that cognitive scientists often point out is that like we can replicate the emotions, that like we're a very emotional species. And right. So the story can trigger the pride or the fear, the anxiety, the togetherness that we all want to feel.
So cognitively privileged, when I heard that the first time, it's that you are inclusive. And sometimes people have different capabilities, and the ability to bring people along when maybe they haven't had a frame of reference that allows them intellectually to understand those things. And again, the thing I took away the most the first time we talked was how inclusive you are in the learning environment. How do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting connection. Like stories are tools of group formation, and so like that's our task as coaches, right? Is to I think it's why we're so fascinated with sport, which is it kind of tells the story of evolution all over again, which is, can we form cohesive groups where people subsume their individual, where the people both want to compete as individuals, but they also have to limit their own personal desires to achieve something as a group, and everyone has a role in that. Like there's nothing lonelier than your team wins and you feel like you didn't contribute, and everyone's celebrating in the locker room and you're like, did I contribute to this win? Like, or maybe even like I got on the floor for 5 minutes and I gave the ball away and I'm like, wow, I actually like.
Doug, to your point, I had a player who won the NBA championship, and he did play, and he asked himself, do I deserve a ring?
Do I deserve to be in here? Yeah. I think that's the loneliest feeling. So I think like inclusiveness is like, I was listening to this podcast. I think sorry for the digressions. I think one of the most interesting things about sports is no one has any idea how to do halftime talks. It's like there's almost no research on it. Like what works at halftime, right? Like if you want to like win with your master's thesis or your PhD thesis or some research, like halftime talks would be a great thing to try and study. Halftime is as much about what you do as what you say, that what athletes people are asking themselves this question, which is like, am I connected to the team? Does the team love me? Have I done my role? And like the first thing you should do is have everyone touch each other, like form a circle, get close, feel connected, right? That nonverbal experience of like, I'm reconnected to my team, I'm reaffirmed, is as important as anything tactically that you say at halftime. But then just to go back to something that you were saying, like I think the teaching environment has to constantly tell everyone that they matter to the environment. Like a very simple example of this is you ask a question of your players, and over time, and you don't specify who you want to answer the question or how. So you just kind of ask the question rhetorically. What should we do? What should we do when we get the ball? What are our goals when we get the ball in midfield and we have numbers up, right? And so Zach and Jordan are highly verbal, and they always are the guy who answers the question, and they want to please the coach. So they say the first thing they can think of off the top of their head out loud. They're highly verbal. You're not really getting their best thinking from them. But one of the other things that's happening is the rest of the team is like, oh, I'm never going to answer that question. He's not really asking me. He's asking rhetorically, and Zach and Jordan always do the answering. So I'm never going to answer out loud. I don't really even have to think about this question. And maybe it's not that important whether I do answer. So I think that cold calling is really important. Pause, hold your thoughts on this one. We've just won the ball in midfield. We have numbers up. What do we want to think about? Take a couple seconds. Great. George, what do you think we should do here? Laura, what's in our game model here, right? Yeah, beautiful. Glad you guys, like asking people, targeting questions at them specifically, which is another name for cold calling, tells people that they matter. And this is really interesting. Like in the school sector, like there are a lot of people who really hate this idea, and they feel like,
why?
It's unfair to children to put them under the pressure of asking them questions when they haven't volunteered to tell you what they think. And I think that is exactly wrong. Like I sometimes tell the story. I cold called my daughter at dinner once, and people laugh and they roll their eyes, and I'm like, but let me tell you why I did it. Because I have 3 kids, and my two older kids are 5 years older than my littlest daughter. So we're sitting around dinner one night, and the 2 older kids are having a debate about science classes in high school. And my daughter is like, this teacher wasn't prepared for the lab sucked, it was a waste of my time. Which my middle daughter can be pretty judgmental. And my son is like, don't be so judgmental. She's a good teacher, give her a chance, you're going to love this class. And so they're having a debate about, and I'm looking at my little daughter, she's in middle school. She doesn't even have science labs. Like they barely have science at all. She's down at the end of the table, and she's like, she's in her first science class, and she's like, she's asking herself, am I a legitimate participant? Like, am I credible in this conversation? Am I part of this conversation right now? So I cold called her, and I said, well, what do you think, Willa? Like, what are your science classes like? And are there some times when this happens to you? And that invites her into the conversation, and it tells her that she is a member in full standing of the group. And just like to tell this story another way, I have a friend who works in sub-Saharan Africa, in northern Ghana, in a very rural part of Ghana, where basically the unspoken message of culture is girls do not speak in class unless spoken to. But there's no rule about that. It's an unspoken part of the culture. And what they found was that the best way to get girls to speak in class was to cold call them, to basically one, violate the norm, but to have the teacher say, you matter here. Your opinion is important. Tell us what you think. And that when they did that, then the girls started to volunteer and to speak, and because they perceived themselves to be members in full standing. And I think that this happens all the time in the sports setting. Am I important enough to have a question directed? Does it matter whether I understand what the role of the six is? Does it matter whether I understand our defensive spacing right now? I think one of the, I talk about this with NBA teams all the time, right? There are 18 guys on the NBA roster. There are 10 guys on the court. It's 5v5. So 8 guys are standing on the sidelines. One of the most important things you can do is either A, have the coach say, turn to one of the guys on the sidelines, Jerry, what do you think? Right? What do you think of our spacing right now? Your opinion matters right now, even though you're not in the game. Or have a coach on the sideline whose job's to be like, what are you looking at right now, Jerry? What are you noticing about the spacing? That, like, telling people that that they matter all the time, communicating that through our questioning, I think it's very counterintuitive, because like a lot of people think that cold calling is an aggressive thing to do that puts people on the spot, but I think it actually tells them that they matter.
So much to think about. When we asked our class their biggest takeaway, the most common answer came back to a symbolic question. Am I important enough to have a question directed at me? This underscores the importance of being seen, heard, and valued. And here are 3 questions for you to reflect on. First, why do you think when coaches use film, 75% of the time they show what it's not supposed to look like as opposed to what it is supposed to look like? Second, what situation have you seen where a coach was short term productive versus long term productive due to their own ego and not what's best for the athlete's development? Lastly, what's been your philosophy on cold calling team members to answer questions in group settings? After listening to this conversation, have you changed your mind on anything, or will you double down on something about your approach? As always, we hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Thanks for listening.